Greetings, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled Exploring the Financial Health of Community Development Organizations, Research Findings from the Grounding Values Study. We appreciate your flexibility as we needed to get started just a little bit late and resolve some technical difficulties. I am Dr. Ruth Jones-Nichols, Executive Vice President for Local and National Programs at the Local Initiative Support Corporation, also known as LISC. LISC is one of the country's largest community development nonprofits, helping forge vibrant, resilient communities of opportunity for all across America. We work with residents and partners across the country to close systemic gaps in health, wealth, and opportunity so that people and places can thrive. At LISC, we know that community development organizations are essential in a movement spanning decades, if not centuries, to help local residents, businesses, and stakeholders shape their own future. These organizations have traditionally provided a host of services focused on things ranging from housing affordability and economic development to climate resilience and healthy food access. The research you will hear about today is the first in decades to assess the contributions of community development organizations and also their financial health. After we hear about this research, we'll have a roundtable discussion and some final reflections about the tie-in to federal policy. I'd like to introduce Chris Walker, a consultant for the Community Opportunity Alliance. Chris is an independent research consultant specializing in community and economic development policies and programs. From 2005 through October 2017, he was Director of Research and Assessment for LISC. While in that position, he was responsible for assembling, conducting, sponsoring, and disseminating research on community development's contributions to the well-being of individuals, families, and communities. He also supported the housing and community development research activities of LISC local programs throughout the United States. Prior to joining LISC, Chris led a community and economic development research program at the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C., where for 19 years, he conducted national studies of federal and foundation-funded affordable housing, community lending, arts and culture, and other community development topics. Please join me in welcoming Chris to walk us through findings of the Grounding Values Study. Chris?
Thank you, Ruth. You make me sound about as old as I am, actually. I'm a little embarrassed to admit that I am the source of the technical difficulty, which is why you can't see me on screen. But we should be able to get through this, okay? Thank you, David, for logistically helping me out here. So I represent for now, the Community Opportunity Alliance, and I want to talk a little bit about the research that we've done. David, next slide, please.
One second, sorry.
This is an unpaid advertisement for the Alliance. We conducted or embarked upon and are continuing a program of research designed to benefit the field in multiple ways that you can see on the screen. The research I'm going to talk about is part of a broader research program to support the field in these ways. Now, most of what I'll talk about comes from a unique database created at our direction by the Urban Institute, which married IRS Form 990 data with our best effort to compile the names of all groups doing this work. There's much more about how we did this in the reports themselves, and you can find all of those on the Alliance's website. And I encourage you to do so because the detail will be more than I can supply here, particularly when it comes to how we did this. I want to give just the briefest of previews. We came away from this research. We thought with better evidence now that the community and economic development field has a substantial presence in terms of production and assets, more than any of us thought going in. Secondly, the field is diverse in terms of the types of activities that do the work. And most groups themselves blend different types of activities within their own organizations. This may be, in my view anyway, the field's most defining characteristic. Thirdly, government support from all levels powers the work. Although different types of groups are more reliant than others on government support. We'll have a look at that. And finally, the field is, in my view, in pretty good financial health, especially when considering that most of the money courses through groups that are strong and not fragile. So the picture is even better than the number of groups would suggest, and I'll get to that too. Next one, David, please. So here's where the groups are. Those are all the green dots. Note that there are groups pretty much where there's population. We'll say a little bit more in a minute about how those green dots are distributed. It also shows the total assets and revenues. 52 billion in assets, 23 billion in revenues. Those look like big numbers to me. Bigger than we thought going into this study. Next one, David, please. Here are estimated production numbers for only a 3-year period between 2019 and 2021. Now, these numbers come from a separate national survey the Institute conducted for us in 2022. But part of our overall program is, as David mentioned, or I'm sorry, as Ruth mentioned, is to put some numbers on what our impacts are in the field in terms of housing units produced, in terms of housing counseling, in terms of home repair and weatherization, and so on. Next one, David, please. So here's what I mean about the diversity of the field. Most of our 4,200 groups do real estate, but only 28% do there as their primary line of work. That's that blue 28% that you see down at the bottom of your screen. The largest single group of organizations involved in doing some kind of community development work, including housing development of various kinds, are social service agencies. So quite a bit of what we're doing is embedded within organizations that don't necessarily define themselves as community development agencies or place-based agencies, even though quite a lot of those 39% are community action agencies, which I would say are emphatically place-based. Now, note that we did not act, there's community lenders on that chart, and notice that we didn't actively seek them out for this study. The ones that we captured and to analyze are the ones that already actively participate in groups or associations devoted to place-based work. And so they showed up on lists of associations of various kinds, either in the states or federal, that are involved in receiving and spending community development money for federal level and elsewhere. Next one, David, please. Next one. We're going to skip this one. Okay. So here are the same groups that we have revenues attached now. These are dollars and millions. So that dark blue social services bucket that you saw in the last slide, we've now tagged it with about almost $14 billion worth of expenditures. This was in 2018, which at the time we did this work is the last data we had available. And right now, if we did it again, we'd probably have 2022 data. IRS is just a bit of a lag. 3.8 billion that you see there in that sort of lighter blue are the classic community development agencies that we generally think of as CDCs. So, and that 3.8 billion does not include project money. That's operating money, no capital. All right, just so you understand it, this is what they spend on themselves or what they spend to commission work from others. Okay, but there's no, that is not project money. So that's $3.8 billion. Which is, of course, dwarfed by the project money itself. Next one, please, David. Okay. This slide, at the bottom, you'll see that gray bar. These are the median revenues for the groups in our sample. That means half the groups make generate $1.4 million of revenue and above, and half generate $1.4 million and below. Notice that the median group, half and half, real different across different types of agencies. Social service agencies by far and away the bigger. Next one, David. Not to harp on services, but note that when any type of group gets involved in workforce development, housing counseling, family servicing, and so on, the revenue demands go up dramatically. So those dark blue bars are organizations that aren't social service agencies, but are doing social services as part of their mission. Real estate developers, real estate managers, planning and organizing groups, lenders. When groups start doing services, the revenue demands go up. Why? Because most likely because they're paying their own staff to do direct services to clients, or they're commissioning or contracting with groups to provide services in the communities within which they work. So this is in addition to development, and it's that combination that is, I think, one of the distinctive features of our field. And this chart is simply to show that when you start doing those distinctive things, more money needs to happen in order to drive that. Next one, please, David. So, oh, I switched this up. Do the next one, and then we'll come back to that one. This is the last thing I'll say about funding flows. And it's about reliance on government sources of funding. That dark blue bar, so for each, what these bars are is the percentage of revenues from basically three different sources. The dark blue is government. The light blue is contributed revenue, like foundations or what's raised directly from the community. And that orangish looking bar is program income or earned income. Okay, so notice that social service agencies at the top, more than half of their revenue comes from government. But as you go down the list, from social services to planning, organizing, to real estate management, to lending, to real estate development, the dependence on government revenue from all sources goes down. And for those last three real estate tied groups, real estate managers, lenders, or real estate developers, their reliance on earned income, program income, is pretty substantial. So essentially, I mean, if you think about it this way, what they're not getting from government, they're earning by themselves. And it's sort of by design. This is the way the whole sector is kind of set up to operate. But here, you know, we've known this in the past, but it's good now to have some data. We can put some magnitudes to it. Okay. Now back to the last one, David, please. The previous one. This is a slight detour, but it's interesting enough. I thought people would want to see it. Regional variations in coverage in our field have long been of interest, and so we looked at that. Now, the dark blue bars at the top of each of these sets show the region's percentage of the nation's poverty population. So the Northeast at the top, that top group, top three bars, has 15% of the US people in poverty. The Midwest has 20% of the nation's poverty population, and so on. The lighter blue bars are the percentage of the nationwide community economic development spending by groups located in each region. And the yellow bars are the percent of the groups nationwide located in each region. So two regions I want to highlight. The top set of bars, those top group, is the Northeast. It has 15% of the nation's people in poverty, but 28% of the spending in the sector takes place there. We've always thought about the Northeast as being, in terms of community development, well-developed, relatively well-functioning, good ecosystems, good funding flows. I think these data kind of demonstrate that. If you go down to the South, which is the third group of bars down, it's a totally different story. 43% of the nation's poverty, 27% of the spending in our field. We've always thought about the South as being underserved, and by these numbers, it sure is. So there's some other geographic stuff of interest. You might want to go online and download that particular brief that we did. It's on the site. But I did want to show this regional chart because we can now finally put some numbers to what we've all sort of known all along. So now let's turn to financial health. So to examine the financial health of groups in the field, we had two primary challenges. The first was to develop a satisfactory measure of health in the first place. And the second, to find a way to make use of a sort of a less than perfect database to do the analysis. Fortunately, to do this, we partnered with NeighborWorks America, which has long been systematically examining the financial health of their members. And over time, NeighborWorks had developed and tested a set group of criteria for measuring the good health, measuring excellent health, I should say, and fragile health, which they then apply across their cohort of groups. So that solved our first problem. We had a valid and tested measure. NeighborWorks has been using this operationally for years, and they've, as a matter of practice, they've honed it to, but these are the indicators that we think make most sense for us as we think about technical assistance packages to help organizations manage and improve their finances. So terrific, we've got that. What they also had is they stored, collected, and analyzed audit data, which is the best way to judge an organization's well-being. Now, IRS data isn't audit data. It's reported as decent enough data, but they're not as comprehensive and they're not as precise as audit data. And in addition, they say something about the partnerships that, like including the real estate partnerships that groups have, and the IRS does not do that. So we matched our IRS data and when the story it told us with the audit data that they collected for their own members. And then we were able to calibrate the IRS data to the audit data so that we could be telling a similar story with both sets of indicators. So now we've got a good measure and we've got a way of fitting the IRS data to a better set of data. So we're pretty proud of this. Nobody's ever done this before. So in some ways, you guys are the first to see the results of this. So let's go to the next one, David, please. It's going to be a little hard to read, and for that I apologize, but here are the NeighborWorks criteria for excellent health. The criteria are listed down the side. I hope you can read those. And the columns represent the percent of groups that passed each of the indicators. So the second one down is one indicator for, oh, this is fragility. Back one up, David, please. This is the exceed measures. So the top, that is, they are exceeding expectations or standards, and we call those excellent. Those were, financially excellent groups. And just as an example, for our, 4,200 groups that we did, I think it's actually less than that. I can't read from what I think it's 38 something. Positive cash flow from operations in 2 of the past 3 years is that top indicator. And it shows that 57% of the groups pass that measure. And so each of these other measures are ones that were used in our test of whether a group was in excellent health or not. Okay. Again, download the reports, way easier to follow, much more explanation. But go to the next one then, David. And this was a separate financial fragility measure that NeighborWorks developed and that we operationalized. And these are, and you can see there's cash flow measures, there's asset measures. In order to count as financially fragile, a group had to, I think it was fail at least 5 of the 10 measures. In the previous section, if you had 7 out of the 10, you were sort of graduated into financial excellence. And then the other groups fell somewhere in between, right? Depending on how many measures of excellence that they passed. So go to the next slide, please, David. And this is the result of our work. The dark blue are the excellent ones we judge to be excellent. Light blue is good, 34% adequate, like not in any danger, but could be better. 18% are the groups that are financially fragile. They're in pretty rough shape. Cash flow position is weak. Their net assets are either negative or declining, not in good shape at all. Now, 18, I don't know necessarily what to make of that number, 18%. But going in, if you had told me that we would find that our financially weakest set of groups comprised 18% of the total, I think I'd be okay with that. I think the stereotype of the sector is it's way worse. So I think that, if I were a funder of this sector, either from the private side or the public side, I would be reasonably confident that money that I was putting into this group of organizations was in pretty good hands. Now, this is even more true if we look at revenues. Next slide, David, please. Oh, crap. Percent of the groups, percent. Yes, thank you. Sorry, I reordered these, but I couldn't get them to you. This is the same set of categories. Excellent, good, adequate, fragile. But we're looking not at the numbers of groups, but of the revenues that flow through each of these categories. So recall that 18% of the groups are fragile if you just look at the number of groups, but only 11% of the money is flowing through these organizations. So if you wanted to think about it like this, 18% of the money, no matter what the source is, might be thought of as at risk. I'm sorry, 11% of the money might be thought of as at risk. They're flowing through financially fragile organizations. Those are the groups for which, if you're looking to, if you're looking at worst case, that's where I would pay attention to. But we're only talking 11% of the money. On the other hand, if you look at those organizations that are either excellent or good, we're looking at 61% of the revenues flowing through groups that we really don't have to worry much about at all, which again, I think is a pretty good result. I defer to others with more experience than I, but I think those are some pretty decent numbers. Now, back up just a bit, David, please. To the previous slide, we did do some work to determine whether or not certain kinds of groups were in poorer financial health than others. It comes no surprise at all that the percentage of groups that are, these are only the fragile organizations, by the way. I'm sorry, these are the percentage of groups in each decile of expenses. So from left to right, the smallest 10% is over there on the left. And the largest decile over on the right is the largest 10% in terms of how much they spend in a given year. So these are 10 equal categories. So generally speaking, the smaller the group, the more fragile its condition. So in those three smallest deciles over on the left-hand side, the fragility rates run 25, 30, 27%. In the three largest deciles, we're looking at 10, 17, and 11%. So this pattern really isn't surprising to anybody. But now again, we know the magnitude of our problem. And we can begin to say a few things about what factors may contribute or drive that. Next one, David, please. And then the next one. Yes. Another speculation on our part was, well, we've made so much of the diversity of the kinds of groups, perhaps financial health is also linked somehow to the kinds of groups there are. And we find, generally speaking, no. Now, part of this might be an artifact of the fact. Artifact sounds bad. It's the natural result of the way in which NeighborWorks applies basically their fragility numbers. They're peer matched. That is, developers are matched to developers and social service agencies are matched to social service agencies because they have very different financial profiles. But so in some ways, we've made some differences which might appear because we adopted the same standard for everybody. We've done it more sensibly by basically saying you get judged by the group that you're in. And when we look across the types of organizations that we've been talking about all along, we find that generally speaking, the patterns of fragility and excellence are pretty similar across groups. Now, if there's any departure here, it's the lenders. You'll notice that next to the last bar has more blue in it than anything else. Those are the lenders, and I surmise it's because they have the most predictable revenue flows. There may be other reasons too, but anyway, I think that this pattern here is also good for the field. We're a diverse field, but that doesn't count against us in some way because some organizations are more difficult to run than others. Okay. The last slide then, again, difficult to read. I'm sorry about that, but you will, again, if you go to the website and download our last report, you'll get a better handle on this. This slide, down the side, we've switched up a little bit the types of groups and how we define them, but the groups I'm going to pay most attention to are that second group, which are real estate developers, and we organize those by size. And then the bottom group are the social service agencies. Across the top are criteria of fragility. Okay, and so we wanted to look at the fragile groups, and we wondered whether they were fragile for different reasons. And the answer is yeah, sure, sort of. If you look at the blue checks, those are the groups, or those are the indicators and the groups that failed more than 70% of the particular indicator. And so you'll notice there's 3 indicators where more than 70% of the groups fail, no matter what kind of group you are. And there are 2 cash flow indicators over on the left-hand side, and then there's an asset-based indicator sort of toward the right-hand side. So there is a broad commonality in terms of groups fail for the same reason. But when we look at those black check marks, and those are groups that, or those are areas where a group in that category fails 20% more often than groups in the average for all groups. So it's a little bit of extra that explains why groups in that category fail. So down in the lower left, you'll see those 4 circled groups. I'm sorry, there's 4 circled check boxes. Those are for social service agencies, and those are both asset-based cash flow indicators. When social service agencies show financial weakness, they do so because their cash flow isn't very good. But if you go to the top right and you see those 7 indicators, 8 indicators, black and white check boxes that are circled, those are for developers, and those are asset-based indicators. When developers get into financial difficulty, it's because their asset ratios aren't very good. They've got negative net assets. They've got, over a couple of years, they have negative net assets. They have more debt than they're able to pay out of operating revenue. And so those are indicators of weaknesses on the asset side. Stands to reason, they're different kinds of groups. So they have different kinds of financial needs. So that's all I want to say about the findings. A few concluding comments. The people on this panel, and I dare say just about everybody in the audience, knows more about their policy concerns and what kinds of, I don't know, conclusions they would draw from this research than I do. But, you know, I think if I were doing advocacy, I'd be saying that, you know, this is a sector that's important. It's a sector that does a lot of diverse stuff, and that makes it pretty unique. And it's also a sector that, it is a sector that relies on government revenues. So you in Madison or in Topeka or Sacramento or Washington, your government money matters a lot for us to be able to do this stuff. Now, that's not anything anybody doesn't already know. But we can put some numbers on it now and say, not only is your money important, but you can see from this research that it's, generally speaking, very well managed. So that's what I take away from this. And I look forward to any questions you may have, or you know, the further discussion.
Thank you so much, Chris. And thanks for presenting under technological extremes. So grateful that we are able to share this really critical and informative work. I want to introduce myself. I'm David Greenberg. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Vice President for Community Research and Impact at LISC. And I just want to acknowledge that though this is a very informative research presentation, it comes to people in the audience who really spend their days trying to build strong communities and strong organizations against really tremendous headwinds, including, as some raised in the Q&A, recent headwinds of COVID, about the end of pandemic era funding, which has caused strains for years now among community development staff and the governments that support it, and some recent high-level examples of warning, such as the fate of the Skid Row Housing Trust. So I'm going to be moderating some discussion among our excellent panelists, but I do encourage questions and engagement from the audience, because this really is your reality. We're also obviously going to hear, because it's all on our minds, from Mark Kudlowitz, from our policy team, to think about the federal landscape right now. But to get started, let me introduce our panel more formally. So first, I would like to introduce Cindy Wu. Cindy is a recognized leader in community development who is known for her work to advance equity through collaboration, and she is the Chief Executive Officer of the Our Neighborhoods Capital Fund, or ONCF, which is an emerging CDFI meeting capital needs of community development organizations that serve low-income Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. It was established by National Capacity in 2023. And ONCF is a new vehicle for advancing Capacity's efforts to prevent displacement of AAPI communities, often among some of the country's most expensive and most quickly gentrifying markets. And the work complements and builds on Capacity's 2 decades of experience in policy advocacy, grant making, and organizational capacity building. You've met Dr. Ruth Jones-Nichols. She's a former senior housing official in federal government with decades of community leadership experience, and joined LISC as our Executive Vice President of Local and National Programs in July of 2024. She oversees LISC's 37 metro area program offices, our rural team, and a dozen of sector-specific LISC programs which fuel economic opportunity across the country. Dr. Jones-Nichols most recently was Senior Advisor to the Secretary of HUD, and previously was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Public Engagement. You've met Chris Walker already. So let me start with a question to Cindy. So Cindy, Capacity works with about 100 members, but also has leadership in a much larger coalition of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander CBOs, low-income communities, and it's a diverse coalition. So there's several larger organizations that folks may know, like the Little Tokyo Service Center and the East Bay Asian Local Development Center, but many are smaller groups, as we've discussed, who have other really critical roles in communities, but are emerging when it comes to their role as developers. And the research that Chris is drawing on suggests that real estate holdings are often a key differentiator in CBDO financial health, with groups that hold a larger share of their assets in land or buildings being less vulnerable to financial shocks. And also, some other versions of the research show that there are differences in assets in BIPOC and white leadership. So all this is to sort of tee up the question for you. What needs are you seeing among smaller organizations so that they can access capital and produce housing that also grows their financial strength? And what are some approaches that you feel like are important to take? How are you approaching this task? And what else can grow the capacity and financial strength of emerging developers?
Great. Thanks for the question, David. Thanks for the invitation, and pleased to be here with you, Dr. Ruth. So National Capacity is the national coalition of Asian Pacific American community development. Like you said, David, we're a member organization, about 100 members across the country, and working with a larger coalition too. Today's topic is so relevant to the motivation behind National Capacity's decision to start a CDFI and add access to capital to the toolkit of what we can provide. National Capacity has 25 years of advocacy work, coalition building, pass-through granting, was started by Chinatowns, Japantowns, Koreatowns across the country wanting a national presence, and so has built housing counseling programs, economic empowerment programs. Many of these will be familiar to folks that understand what LISC does also. But what does it look like to add for us as an intermediary, a CDFI option, and then for our members to add real estate to their own toolkits in order for them to strengthen their organizations? And so first, I want to say that we really do this work from a place of trust and responsibility. So a lot of this is through cohort work. The technical assistance that National Capacity provides is putting peers together with one another. We have the benefit of having a membership that has CDCs that have a 40-year history. You named a few of them. With organizations that might have been social service organizations that grew out of really meeting the needs of their clients, a Mongolian community outside of Chicago, the Hmong community in the Twin Cities, and teaching what the more experienced organizations, what their journey was in becoming a real estate developer or real estate property manager to the newer, smaller organizations. So we've seen, you asked, what are some other folks doing here in California? I'm based in California. There's a partnership between Genesis LA and Community Vision, and they've built this great program called CalCore. So one of Capacity's members, Little Manila Rising in Stockton, was able to participate in CalCore, and they had a great learning experience. And what they learned, or what they asked for coming out of it, was to think about like the side chat, the side room, and to be together with their peers to talk about how do you implement what you're learning here, learning these technical skills of pro formas or entitlements or even community outreach. Can we have more peer-to-peer opportunity to talk about the challenges in implementation? And then one more thing I'll say about small organizations growing is that how do you start to scale? How do you get bigger? And so I see a lot of organizations where the ED is trying to do everything. It's a 3-person organization. The ED is trying to add real estate development to what the organization is doing. But how can we help organizations get scaffolded differently? So either it's through partnership, small emerging developer partnering with a larger organization. It's through hiring consultants, or it's through like scraping together to figure out a way for more staff positions. But I think that I see that it can be so slow if you're trying to funnel it all through one person. And then the last thing I want to say is that, of course, it's a tumultuous time. We're going to hear from Mark. We here at our Neighborhoods Capital Fund obviously really want to support members that have the space for their real estate journey right now. And so many members are just dealing with what their clients are dealing with, threats to immigrants, threats to social safety nets. And so just noting that we are member serving first and really wanting to respond to what the members are seeing. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Cindy. So I want to turn to Dr. Ruth. So part of the findings in Chris's presentation really highlighted the variety of contexts, both in which community development organizations operate, and also their strength in different kinds of contexts. And you oversee a variety of programs in all parts of the country. And I'm just wondering if you can reflect a little bit on the principles that LISC uses, given the variety of contexts in which we operate, that can build the capacity and financial stability of community development partners, and in fact, community development ecosystems in different kinds of places.
Thank you so much for that question. And one of the things you noted in your introduction was the fact that I've only been with the organization now for 7 months. And so I have to say that I've spent the last 7 months really learning more about what LISC is, what LISC does, and why our work matters. During my initial learning journey, it has become clear to me that three principles really ground our work. And at LISC, we believe these principles are essential to achieving equitable and lasting impact communities. The first principle is really about focusing on the future, because we know that it takes change. It takes years, sometimes even decades, to realize change that comes as a result of community and economic development efforts. And so with that in mind, we really work to focus our programs and our investment strategies on the things that we believe will change the trajectory of communities. The second principle we focus on is elevating community change goals. As an organization with national scale but a local focus, we are committed to advancing local community-driven agendas that respond to needs and elevate local strengths. In doing so, we know that we have to have an intentional and coordinated strategy to both the direct resources we offer and the change we hope to see in policies and in systems. So again, that second principle is elevating community change goals. The third principle that I have observed as I've traveled across the country to rural communities, suburban communities, urban communities. It's really focused on prioritizing comprehensive investments, because we know from over 40 years of experience that advancing development really requires us to work in ways that are comprehensive and integrated. Those efforts tend to focus on creating and preserving affordable housing, supporting vibrant commercial corridors, and elevating community health, wealth, and education opportunities. So 3 principles: focusing on the future, elevating community change goals, and prioritizing comprehensive investments. Now, you said earlier that there isn't a one-size-fits-all model that can work for every organization and in every community. And in that regard, we know that well-being, or the well-being of communities and the organizations that serve them, will not be driven by access to capital alone. But when Chris talked about fragility, what we're seeing in the sector, it definitely resonated with me in terms of the work we do, because we know that strong organizations require capital investments, but they also require other forms of support. And that's really why our approach is focused on not just that capital access, but making sure we pair technical assistance with financial support, making sure we elevate resident leaders in communities who have lived experience and can be a part of the new talent pipeline to sustain organizations. We also work to ensure that we are supporting the needs of individuals today and for tomorrow. Last week, I was in Kalamazoo and Toledo, and in Kalamazoo, I had a chance to meet with a developer who has really been attempting to create and preserve affordable housing for several years. And one of the things he said to me during our engagement was, had it not been for LISC staying with me over the long term and really helping me understand how to build my capacity and making strategic investments in my business, I wouldn't be here at a point where I am helping to revitalize neighborhoods within this community. he talked about how even his organization had experienced some fragility because he didn't anticipate the type of capacity he would need to build as a small developer. And it again was, I think, an indicator of the comprehensive work that we have to do, the fact that we have to stay with organizations over a period of time, the fact that we have to help them not only grow their access to capital, but diversify the type of capital upon which they become dependent in order to ensure that their efforts are measurably impactful over a period of time. So those are the three guiding principles, and that's really how I think they help to shape the work that we do. To access to capital, but also grow the capacity of our partners.
Thank you so much for sharing that comprehensive vision. I want to leave room for questions from the audience, which have been really excellent. But before doing that, I want to turn to Mark Kutlowitz, who's Senior Director for Policy. Mark, Chris's research showed that I believe for the average organization, about 40% of their revenues came from government. Given the current landscape, what can you tell us about what the field should be thinking about?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today and honored to be amongst these panelists. I think it's really important to ground all this before providing some updates. And that LISC was founded over 40 years ago with our North Star being to support local affordable housing and community development nonprofits. And that is still our charge today. The policy and the research team that David leads and I get to work with, we're really happy to support this work, both financially and being on the Research Advisory Council, because we know we need data. We need new data to make our case to Congress for resource provision for local affordable housing groups. So this really helps guide our federal policy work. And we're firm believers in data informing policy when making the best argument to decision makers. I also wanted to, before talking about some challenges, which there are many, and opportunities, which there are still some, to also reflect a little bit back on the community development movement. And I think it's important in this moment. You saw on one of the graphs that Chris produced, community planning. It used to be when the sector was more formalized with federal resources many years ago, that community organizing, which is still a core part, but was an even larger part of the work done by local nonprofit housing organizations and others. And I really think that's going to be something that we're going to see become more ascendant, and you're already seeing it taking place in different forms as challenges are presented in communities by new policies coming out of DC that flow down to underserved places. And I think that's a really important point, because it's going to take collective advocacy in this moment from all of us to essentially at least sustain the resources that the field depends on. Yes, 40% of groups are using government revenue, but I think if we actually could get drilled down a little bit further in the data and looked at where relative poverty is higher, you would see even a higher proportion in those communities that lack philanthropic and other private sector resources. So these are really, really important dollars, and the policy team in collaboration with all the LISC local offices and our partners take it very seriously what's going on right now in Washington, DC. So I just want to spend a couple minutes with that sort of framing, saying that we do have opportunities. In the near term, there's a giant tax bill that will go through this year, because the current tax bill and a lot of the tax cuts from it from 2017 expire. We are working in partnership to try to expand the low-income housing tax credit to make sure that the new market tax credit program can go on beyond this year. And to hopefully get new tax credit and resources across the finish line, including a dedicated tax credit for owner-occupied affordable home ownership in economically distressed places. That is an opportunity, and we're going to need to continue to work with everyone to get that across the finish line. Because as the pie graph showed, we saw developer fees and others, and a lot of those come from the opportunity that the federal credits provide to preserve and construct affordable housing and community development projects in our country, including for nonprofit organizations. The challenges are very numerous, just to be frank. We have probably the most challenging appropriated spending environment for the next 2 years in recent memory. These are critical programs that are at risk. The HUD programs, Community Development Block Grants, the Home Investment Partnership Program, the Section 4 program that LISC utilizes to provide capacity building resources to our partners, USDA Rural Housing Service programs, CDFI fund programs, the Department of Treasury. But the good news is that the margins in the House are very small. They, it is essentially an evenly split Congress. And there are moderates that are often willing to cross the aisle. In the Senate, it still takes 60 votes to pass a spending bill and bake it into public law. So we have some mitigants to some of the more extreme positions we see articulated more and more in the media. But we can't just rely on Congress to do its job. Congress has to hear from us. It has to hear from LISC. It has to, more importantly, hear from our partners on the ground. So we always welcome working in partnership to communicate that message so that we can sustain those resources. Happy to take questions, but just wanted to provide that update. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that context, Mark, both in the current landscape and the history of the community development movement and the kinds of organizing and advocacy, both locally and nationally, that supports the sector. Lots of great engagement in the Q&A. Lots about the research presentation that Chris did for us. I'm going to try to synthesize a little bit. A couple of the questions, Chris, really were about what we might expect to see after 2018, which is where I think the data collection, or at least the data presented, may have stopped. We've experienced a pandemic, some of the other, and a flood of pandemic era funding, and then the end of that funding. Any insights about, well, first, some folks asked, any plans to do more work on this using more recent data, and or any insights about how findings might be different now than in 2018?
I wish I had a good answer, which I don't. I think somebody earlier mentioned that the loss of the pandemic assistance, which of course is not just a community development problem. It's a problem for school districts. It's a problem for hospitals. It's a problem for everybody. So I can only surmise that it's been it could be a bit damaging. Maybe that 18% number isn't 18% anymore in terms of fragility, but I really can't say. Yes, we are. We're in discussions now about how we update these data, and it would do two things. One, it would allow us to say something that's a bit more recent, especially because things have changed. And second, and related to that, is that we'll have that same group of organizations. We'll be able to look at them over time, which we really haven't spent much time doing. So we'll have a 2018 baseline. We'll have a 2022, if we do it now, we'll have 2022, and we'll be able to say something about at least, what transpired in that 3-year period. So that's, yeah. That's what I got for you, David.
Thank you so much.
Uh-huh.
I'm interested in any of the other panelists' response to that question about what they're seeing more recently. But also want to bring to mind, in case anyone wants to answer, some of the comments really, I think, center on the why. So Chris gave us a good snapshot of financial health, but what are some of the things that you're seeing that drive financial stability within community organizations? And I guess welcome Chris to think about that as well as any of the other panelists, Cindy, Dr. Ruth in particular.
I'll add a thought here, which is just that we live in this really volatile world right now, right? So since the data came out, pandemic, I think many groups at the beginning of the pandemic were worried that about their own existence, right? And then a flood of resources came that are all ending or have ended. And I feel like we're in that moment now, just really not knowing what's going to come. And so how can we do scenario planning? How can we create space in our day-to-day to respond? How can we have protocol for when it's a crisis, when it's not, because you could be in crisis all day long. And so just thinking about how we work a little bit differently and provide resources for the organizations we support.
Just add one thing that hasn't really come up in our discussion. In 2020, there was a real reckoning in our country. And I think as part of a number of things that happened during that time, we saw a commitment to equity and racial equity in particular. And in 2025, what we're seeing is a reassessment of whether or not those values that have now been embedded within the work of many organizations are the right values. And so in some ways, that could create not only vulnerability within the sector, but some fragility in terms of the financial health of community and economic development organizations that have seen a tremendous increase in public and private revenue that has helped to scale and sustain the work. And so I think it's a moment of uncertainty. And as Cindy said, it will be necessary for us to do some scenario planning and look at innovative ways of supporting the sector so that the work that has been so important over the years, not just the past 5 years, but the past many decades, will remain available to communities when they need it the most. Our vision at LISC is to create communities of opportunity for all. And we will remain committed to that. But it is a moment of uncertainty, and we'll have to navigate our way through it. We can't hear your audio.
Can folks hear me? Thank you so much for those reflections about where we are at this moment, uncertainty, and yet the need to come together so as to make sense of where we are. Cindy and Dr. Thank you both for that. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Mark. There are additional questions in the Q&A that we'll get to in our follow-up mailer. Thank you. But just appreciate everyone's attendance and wish you a pleasant rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you, David.